Wildlife and bird photography is a lifelong experience. It's a never ending journey of improvement, and at the end of the day, there's always something to learn about how to improve your photos. Out of personal experience, after doing this for 7 years now, I'm still constantly learning new techniques and new visions of how to capture a good wildlife image, which makes this passion so exciting for me to pursue. Today, I'm joined by Simon D'Entremont, who is a fantastic bird photographer of many years and here to show us some of his most important tips regarding bird photography. Simon, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
Yeah, you as well. You have literally just exploded on YouTube since you started, so that's been really cool to see. Really excited for you and your journey. You have some fantastic images, and your photos really feel and fit like they fit into the definition of artwork, in my opinion. And every image that you take feels like there's more value to it than just simply kind of like a documentary, kind of capturing whatever is there in the moment. And I really appreciate that about your photos. So yeah, to get images like that, I think it's important as a bird photographer to know good techniques on how to approach your subjects. That way they can kind of feel comfortable while you're hanging out with them. You get some good behaviors. In one of your more recent shorebird videos, you actually talked a lot about this as well. What are some important techniques to start us off, in your opinion, on how to learn how to approach birds?
I think it's an important point. To become more accomplished and advanced in bird photography, it's really important to have natural behavior and capture behavior. Preening, feeding, stretching, sleeping, these types of things. A bird in high alert because it's scared doesn't make a great photo. In terms of getting closer to birds, as you mentioned in my latest video, I talked about basically letting the birds come to you. And on shorebirds in particular, it's easier because shorebirds tend to feed along the beach in a certain direction. So when you see them, a lot of people try to huddle up behind them and then they just kind of chase them down the beach. So you're never seeing the front of the bird. And photographing the front of the bird is actually quite important in bird photography. Photographing the back, unless they're looking over their shoulder, doesn't make a very good photo. So being predictive, trying to see where the birds are going, go 100 yards down the beach and just hunker down. And quite often they'll just feed and go right around you if you're not moving. So that's a really good technique. Another one I use is the zigzag technique. Rather, if there's no cover, so you use cover when you can, hide behind a tree, crawl on the grass. But if there is no cover, one good technique is the zigzag technique, that rather than going in a direct line towards the bird, which will always make it feel encroached upon, is to zigzag back and forth, always going a little bit closer, but never walking directly towards your target. And for some birds, you can kind of trick them a little bit into doing that. The other thing to do is to watch the bird behavior. If you're walking towards a bird and they notice you, you should stop and wait to see if it resumes its normal behavior. If it does, then you can creep a little bit further. But if it keeps staring at you, there's no point anymore in trying to get any closer. You're not going to see any normal behavior, and eventually you're just going to flush the bird, which is not, good ethics nor good for photography.
Nor good photos, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, if you're just chasing them the whole time, you're just going to be getting shots of their butt the whole time, and that's not exactly what you're looking for. Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly, that's right. Good stuff. I really liked how you were showing that in your shorebird video, and it was awesome how it worked out for you so well with the piping plover in that moment, and you just got some incredible images doing exactly what you're talking about, being patient, just pre-positioning yourself. And yeah, that's kind of just evidence that it works well. A really interesting tip that you gave in one of your more recent videos on just bird tips was positioning yourself upwind of a large perched bird, like a bird of prey, maybe an owl or a hawk or something, which was really cool because even me doing this for 7 years now, I never knew that as a tip. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of curious. I think maybe that's not a super well-known tip. What's the purpose in doing that, and why do you find it more effective to face upwind of a perched bird of prey?
It's a physics situation. Airplanes need to take off and land into the wind because the added lift adds to their aerodynamics. And large birds have the same thing. So a swan or a goose has a very difficult time taking off with the wind. So they take off and land into the wind. So that leads to a couple of observations. Number one, you want to be photographing the front of the bird. If you're upwind of a large bird that's landing and taking off into the wind, you're going to be photographing their butts, like you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are upwind of the bird, they'll always take off and land facing you. So if you're approaching a goose on a pond, and I don't know if you photograph geese a lot, you kind of get a heads up when they're going to take off, because one starts to honk and the other one starts to honk, and then when 500 birds are all honking in unison, they're going to go.
It's a party, yeah.
When you think they're going to leave, you go upwind of their situation and they'll all take off towards you, or at worst, sideways to you, because they won't be taking off with the wind. And that way you get the shots of them flying facing you. Same thing with ducks and birds in the water. When they're bobbing in the waves, I live by the ocean. When they're bobbing in the waves, they're bobbing facing the wind. So if you go in a situation where the wind's at your back, they'll be bobbing in the water facing you, so you can get those head-on shots. And if they take off, you get a head-on shot. And if new birds come and land with them to join them, you'll get head-on shots. And those are tips. The good news is that the longer you do bird photography, the better you get at it, because you accumulate these tips. Mm-hmm. So, another one, for example, is large birds will often defecate. They'll poop before they leave their perch. So ospreys are famous for this. They'll be eating. So if I see an osprey on a tree eating a fish, number one, I will go, depending on the sun situation, but to get the light in the right direction, but I'll go upwind. And if I see him poop, then I crank up the shutter speed, because I know he's going to jump. And when he jumps, he'll come towards me, because I'm upwind of him. So you combine these tips to get better photos, and with experience, it's kind of good news for photography. Even without changing any settings in your camera, 5 years down the road, you'll be a better photographer than you were 5 years before, just by accumulating this knowledge.
Most definitely. That's great. That's fantastic. Yeah. It's learning how to recognize those experiences. And you were just talking about an osprey defecating. And yeah, I think that was when I first actually figured it out, was actually not through learning that from someone directly, but there was an osprey. This was 4 or 5 winters ago, that I was trying to photograph all throughout the winter. It was always on the same, tree trunk at the top of this one dead snag every day. And so I'd go back there and try to get multiple different photographs of it. And every time I noticed that it would defecate right before it'd start flying. And that was a case of just being out in the field, not necessarily learning it because someone told me, but being out in the field, I realized, oh, this is a thing. And
exactly.
Yeah, it's really cool to be able to combine those tricks. And that's gold. I never knew about the flying into the wind. So that was great knowledge that you shared with me. So thanks for sharing that.
Happy to.
So for bird photographers just starting out, how would you recommend you practice technique and skill of these different things that you're sharing, these different tips, these different tricks? How would you recommend practicing those things? I guess mostly in regards to getting experience on maybe tracking subjects, composing subjects, shooting birds, etc.
I think the best advice is to start with baby steps and go after the easy stuff and work your way up. If you want to learn how to shoot flying birds, don't go photograph terns, swallows, or puffins. They're amongst the hardest things to photograph. Big birds are usually easier to photograph. For birds in flight, for example, they fly slower. You need less shutter speed. So a bald eagle or a great blue heron is going to be easier target than a hummingbird or a kinglet. So go after the big birds, easy birds. If you go to public parks, they're more used to people, so it's easier to get close to them. And there's nothing wrong with starting out at your local duck pond. I think people shun duck ponds, but it's great practice, and you get to see great behaviors at the duck pond. And another one of these behavior tips is one of the pretty photos for birds and ducks is when they're sitting up in the water and flapping like that. You get that flap shot. That's actually a predictable shot. A duck will preen, that is, clean its feathers using oil off of a gland, and it'll preen away. And after it's done preening, it'll duck and dunk its head 3 or 4 times. Then it'll stand up and do the flap. So when you see a duck preening and you see them start dunking, that's when you get down low, crank up the shutter speed, and get ready for that standing up flapping shots. Again, understanding bird behavior helps you get the shot, and there's nothing wrong practicing that shot at the local duck pond.
Yep. Most definitely. Even this year, I hadn't gone out to my local duck pond yet this year until about a week and a half ago, I think that was, because I just wanted to try some different techniques, some different compositions. And I was like, you know what, I want to try this with an easy subject rather than doing it with something that's, going to be challenging and difficult and that I'm going to really want to be trying to capture just to get some practice. And so, yeah, nothing wrong at all with doing that. And it provides a lot of good learning opportunity. You're totally right.
Yeah. Even wildlife park and so on, if you're practicing focusing, having a single point autofocus and focusing on the head of a subject and so on, nothing wrong with the wildlife park to practice. And by the seashore, often gulls are an easy target for birds in flight as well.
One of the hardest challenges, I think, as a new bird photographer, as well as getting used to how to find birds and locate birds to photograph in the first place. Beyond, I guess, duck ponds and, the simple stuff like you talked about, how do you recommend learning to locate birds as a beginner?
I think there's a few ways. Having a circle of friends that are into birding is definitely helpful because they've got the experience not only where to find the birds, but here in Nova Scotia, we have a highly seasonal bird sighting cycle. In different seasons, you see different birds at different places. So not only understanding the good spot for birds, but the good spot for birds at what time of year is quite important. So summer locations, spring locations, fall locations, winter locations will be different for different species. And often you need someone with some expertise to figure this out. We have here in Nova Scotia, for example, we have a Nova Scotia Bird Society with, thousands of members and a Facebook page with like 15,000 members. And they post their photos of where they've seen birds. So based on that, you can find out which birds are where. Another good resource is eBird. That's the website ebird.org.
Yeah.
It's kind of a citizen science project run by Cornell University. And on there, you can go find hotspot. Click on find hotspots, and it will show you marked in orange and in red the best spots with the most sighting. Now, that doesn't explain the seasonality to you unless you get into the data a bit. You can click on it and see which birds are being seen in which season. I think the other big trick for birds is people think about bird food more than they think about bird water. But water is just as important for birds for bathing and drinking as is food. The water sources are a great place to go. You go along the ocean, you go along lakes, you go around rivers, and you go into ponds. And you will find birds, and you have a better odds of finding birds there than deep into the woods. So those types of tips are handy. I mentioned already that parks are a good place because birds are used to people and less skittish often. So that's a decent place to go and get approachable birds. Local photo clubs sometimes will have a few birders in them, and they'll take people out on birding tours. And the Nova Scotia Bird Society here in Nova Scotia does have bird outings where they take new bird watchers or birders or bird photographers out on tours at certain locations and help them identify new birds.
Yeah, eBird, you mentioned eBird as one of them. That was a huge resource for me when I first started getting into wildlife photography, birding actually before that. I think I was technically I was a little bit more of a birder before I was a wildlife photographer. But yeah, using the bar charts where you can see the seasonality like you were talking about, huge help.
Exactly.
As well as some
especially
of the
if you're looking for certain species.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're dying to get a photo of a northern cardinal and you never gotten one before.
Yeah.
Looking in that type of resource is great for finding specific birds as well.
Yeah. Are you trying to make me jealous because we don't have them here?
Oh, you don't. Yeah. We actually didn't have them a lot when I was a kid, but in the last 20 years, the numbers have been going up steadily here in Nova Scotia. So most people with a backyard feeder can have a cardinal. And I actually have one. He's my 5 o'clock alarm. Every morning at 5 o'clock, he wakes me up. I'm not joking.
Wow, that's cool. That definitely makes me jealous. Yeah, there's such beautiful birds, and I know on the eastern end of the U.S. and Canada, it sounds like they're relatively common, but over here it's like such a thing where it's like, ooh, I would love to photograph that someday. But yeah, time of day and understanding lighting is also so important. And matters a ton in bird photography. What are some of the biggest tips for shooting bird photography to achieve well-lit photos, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a very important point. My number one, when people send me their photos and say, can you critique my photos? The number one thing I see is they've been taken in the bright midday sun. And the midday is the wrong time to go do bird photography for two reasons. Number one is bird habits. Birds are more active early in the morning and late in the day and the least active in the afternoon. And then you combine that with the light. The best light is in the first couple of hours in the morning and the last couple of hours of the day. And the worst light is the bright afternoon sun. You combine those two things together, and it makes it clear that the morning is the best time, the first couple of hours of the day, the best time to do bird photography.
Yeah.
The next best time is the late evening, and the worst time is the midday. Now, if it's cloudy, not like a gloomy cloudy, but like a bright cloudy, you can do some decent photography in the afternoon. But for the most part, for me, once the sun's up and it's 2 hours past sunrise, I'm either heading home or I'm heading in under the canopy of the trees into the shadows, which creates its own challenges from an ISO perspective and so on. But better that than the full midday sun. Like, for example, here in Nova Scotia, sunrise is at 5:30 this time of year. By 8 o'clock, I'm heading home. And I'm heading home, and I'm walking home from a local marsh, and I meet photographers getting out of their car in the parking lot, heading into the marsh. So I'm leaving, and they're just showing up. So the reality is, you know, with the full bright sun, it's really hard to get good photos. So get under the canopy once the sun is up.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, currently I'm working on trying to capture a species, and we have the same thing, 5:40 a.m. Sunrise time here, trying to work on capturing the species, and it's been really annoying because it's an hour and a half away. Every morning at 3:30 I'm heading out, and I'm leaving by 8, just like you said, and I've been doing that for like 3 days this past week, and it's like, but it's what it takes a lot of times to get those well-lit photos, like you said, so yeah.
It does, yeah.
Yep. 2 weeks ago, I released a video displaying kind of like the side-by-side differences between shooting birds eye level and not. And so while shooting eye level is a way to drastically improve your photography in general, it's also not the only way to getting nice and clean images. What are some things you look out for in order to try to get a clean bird photography image that doesn't feel too cluttered or distracted?
Oh, that's a great point. And kudos to your tip about eye level photos. I think that's the number one tip for improving bird photography is getting eye level photos. If the bird's on the ground, get on the ground with them. If the bird's up a tree, climb up a bank next to them, or go looking for birds where there are no tall trees, just short stunted ones at eye level. So I think that's the right tip. In terms of getting clean photos, I think you're right. Getting a photo of a bird that's all tangled up in the cluttered thickets is not a very attractive photo, and it's really hard to make a good photo of that. That being said, the other extreme of having just a bird on a stick with a clean background, I just call that a bird on a stick, a boas. And I'm going to be making a YouTube video called No More Boas.
No More Boas.
One of these days. Getting away from, because I got into a bit of a rut. That I came home for 2 years in a row with a bird on a stick photo, and after a while they all look the same. So too cluttered in the thickets is too much on one end, and bird on a stick on the other end is not very good.
I like that.
You got to try to find some places with some holes for the background to show through, and that's one of my number one tips, by the way, is the background is part of the photo. And I'm as mindful of my background as I am of my subject. But you're trying to find some interesting things to put in with the bird, not just a clean background. So you want some leaves, you want some moss, you want some texture, you want some lichen, you want a few rocks in the background, clump of grass, a wave splashing behind that sandpiper. You try to find other elements, and that's where being a bit artistic comes in. And by the way, the way I developed this technique is I was getting stuck on the bird on a stick photo, and I thought I've got to get better compositions, and I thought, who does this well? And basically landscape photographers are really good at this compositions and light and patterns and leading lines. So I said, I'm going to try some landscape photography and see if I can bring those skills back to bird photography, and that's exactly what I did. Now, I didn't know it was going to work, but it worked. I went out and studied leading lines and patterns and backlighting. And then I've applied those skills back to bird photography, where I'm looking for patterns with the bird and another bird behind it. Or I'm looking for some backlighting or some side lighting that'll highlight the fluff of a baby chick bird or the fur of a fox. And after a while, you start building in those artistic qualities to your photo. And that, for me, that's my style. I thought it was a problem at one time. I told a friend of mine, I said, I think I'm getting into the stock because people say, "Oh, I knew it was your photo even before I saw your name," and it's made me think, have I gotten into another rut that all my photos look the same? And a friend of mine said, "Yeah, but Michelangelo had a look, and it was never a problem."
Yeah.
So I guess it's not a problem to have a look.
Yeah.
But everyone should find their own look to their photos, but usually it includes finding something good in the photo, but not having the photo cluttered with too much, especially right behind the bird. If the head of the bird has a halo or a hole of clear background, and there can be stuff on the top and the right and the bottom, if the head itself is kind of clean, that can usually work pretty well as well.
Yeah.
So I tend to, if I see a patient bird and I'm looking at it, I tend to move sideways and up and down to get, using parallax.
Yeah.
Try to get the background I want behind the bird. And if the bird's patient, I'm very often doing that, moving left and right and up and down and trying to get the background I want exactly behind the bird.
Yeah, most definitely. That's great stuff. I love everything you shared. I feel very much the same in that it's easy as a bird photographer, especially to want to just get the most clean close-up BOAS image that you are tempted to get, because it's like, ooh, this is maybe a new bird, or it's a bird that you haven't gotten very clearly before. But trying to look for those new, angles and stuff is just so important and so good. And that's something that, like, I was on a podcast with Jamin, I think a few months ago, and we were talking about how I think his work does that beautifully too, but Ray Hennessy, is a master of that, just being able to just get this unique type of scene laid out. And even personally, I'm always striving for that, right? Something that I've tried to identify kind of as like a technique I like to pursue, or a look I like to pursue, as you were kind of talking about, is I really love using foreground in my images. So I'm always constantly looking for how can I include some foreground in this image. I think it's really cool to be able to develop your own style, like you were talking about, not just doing the same thing that everyone else is doing maybe, or just trying to do something different and undone before. So I love everything you shared.
And no one should be ashamed of their bird on a stick photo.
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing. It's actually a natural progression. First, you're happy to find a bird. Then you're happy to find a sharp bird photo.
Yep.
Then you kind of want to clean up the background.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong. I went through that phase, and everyone goes through that phase. And then it's just, once you've got that nailed down, explore the opportunity to take it one step further.
Yep. Yeah. Learning the rules and breaking the rules. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yep. Fast shutter speeds are also one of the more unique things to bird photography and wildlife photography, I think, in general. A lot of other photography types maybe don't have to be as conscious of shutter speeds as much as we do. What are your recommendations on how to manipulate shutter speed in different scenarios and correctly use it as a wildlife photographer?
Oh, that's a great question. Number one is I shoot in manual with auto ISO is my favorite way to shoot. So number one is when I manipulate my shutter speed, I'm not manipulating my exposure. So it's actually making my life easier. I can crank up my shutter speed for a fast moving bird and not have to touch anything else. Whereas if you're in full manual, you might have to change another setting. Now, there's nothing wrong with shooting in shutter priority as well. My number one rule of thumb as a place to start is to use the fraction 1 over your focal length to establish your shutter speed. So if you're using a 400 millimeter lens, shoot at 1/400th, 600 millimeter lens, 1/600th. Now that's for static birds. You have to adjust that for, if you've got really good technique, you can knock that down. I've shot my 500 millimeter lens with a teleconverter, 1.4 teleconverter at 1/100th of a second if there's not enough light, if I have to. But I've nailed down the technique over the years. And if you're photographing jittery birds, like when I'm photographing warblers and kinglets, even though I'm using a 500 millimeter lens, I tend to crank it up to like 1/800th of a second, because those birds are fast, jittery, and flycatchers. They don't stop. So 1/500th might freeze the foreground or the perch, but maybe not the bird. And then flying birds is a whole new ball of wax. But for flying birds, for example, there's an inverse relationship between the size of birds and the amount of shutter speed you need to increase their action flying. Large birds move more slowly, and small birds move more quickly. There are some technical, once you get into the species, you can tinker with that a bit, but a heron or a bald eagle, for example, 1/1000th is usually enough to freeze it if it's just kind of gently gliding by while it's flying. Ducks need like 1/2000th or 1/2500th. I was shooting puffins the other day, and I was using 1/3200th of a second because they're really fast, like 55 miles an hour. That's 90 something kilometers an hour. And if you want to freeze the wings of hummingbirds, you might have to shoot 1/5000th a second. But most of my photography for perched birds is done between 1/500th and 1/1000th of a second. And most of my photography for flying birds is done between 2000 and 3200th a second.
Yeah, you've given a lot of good tips about bird photography, wildlife photography today. If you had to give one single tip that's the most important to learn as a bird photographer specifically, what would that be?
I'm going to cheat and give two top tips. I'll give a short-term tip. Something to implement today is what you talked about earlier, is shooting birds at eye level. Number one tip, if you, a lot of people will show birds, they'll shoot shorebirds while standing up next to them shooting down, or they'll photograph warblers in trees shooting up and shooting their belly. Getting to that eye level is the number one thing to implement tomorrow. The second tip is to spend enough time, this is the long-term tip, to spend enough time in nature to understand the behavior of your subjects. And this is a hopeful tip because it means that 5 years from now, you'll be a better bird photographer and a wildlife photographer than you are now, because you'll learn the tricks and be able to implement them. And it gets easier. It gets easier, and you get better at predicting behavior. I'm at now that I'm out with a friend and I say, okay, that heron's about to take off. I can just tell by their jittery nature that they're about to go. So, you get to learn these types of behavior, and it makes you a better photographer.
I can't remember who it was with, but one of the podcasts we had a few months ago, I was talking with, it might have been Jamin, might have been Josh, I don't know, someone. We were talking about, it's an awesome feeling to be able to look back. It's actually a good feeling to be able to look back at your old photos and kind of be, in a way, kind of be like, oh, that wasn't that great, because that means you've grown a lot. And I love what you're sharing about, like, the hope of that, the more time you spend out, the easier it gets, because you wind up just getting better and better at it. You wind up getting better and better photos over time. And it's cool, because I think even how I intro this whole episode, it's a never-ending kind of hobby and a passion. And one of the things that drives it is that you never quite get the photo that's perfect.
Yeah.
There's always something that you would like a little bit better. So I love that about this hobby, and I love that about all the helpful tips and tricks that you shared. So
I'm happy to, and congratulations for you and your work. It's great. I'm glad to see you doing well on YouTube and enjoying yourself. It's good, I think, for us to have a YouTube community of like-minded people who can help each other, and I think it's good for the hobby and good for the community.
I agree. I love it. Well, thanks for Simon for coming on. If you guys haven't checked out Simon's channel already, I'll leave a link in the description below, so make sure you check it out. He shares some great tips on how to do bird photography well, wildlife photography well, and has some great content. So thank you guys for watching. Make sure you subscribe to Bird Burger below as well, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.